In this video we'll be looking at free trade agreements. So we'll look at the arguments for and against free trade and examine the significance and benefits of free trade agreements such as the European Union. To start off with, let's look at what free trade is. Free trade occurs when countries can trade goods and services in the absence of trade barriers. Trade barriers come in two forms: tariff and non-tariff barriers. Tariffs are simply taxes placed on imported goods. These increase the price of imported goods, making them less affordable for domestic consumers. This incentivizes them to buy domestically produced goods instead. Non-tariff barriers, on the other hand, are any trade barriers that don't involve tariffs, such as quotas, which are physical limits on the quantity of a good that can be imported into a country in a given period of time. Embargoes, which are official bans on trade in some goods or on trade entirely with other countries. Regulations such as mandatory product specifications that increase production costs for foreign exporters, and domestic subsidies that make domestically produced goods cheaper compared to imported alternatives. The goal of free trade is to reduce all of these barriers so that consumers and businesses can trade their goods and services freely across regional and national borders, as if the whole world was an integrated global market. Free trade can deliver many benefits for economic agents and for society as a whole. Firstly, free trade can bring lower prices for consumers. If products can be produced more cheaply overseas, for example due to an abundance of raw materials or of cheap labour in other countries, then making those cheaper products available to consumers through free trade can improve their living standards. Free trade also gives consumers greater choice. Some goods simply can't be produced in a country due to incompatible climates or different cultures that don't exist domestically. Allowing consumers to access these otherwise inaccessible goods, such as bananas from Latin America or wine from France, for example, maximizes their welfare. Free trade also opens up countries to international markets, increasing competition. This puts pressure on firms to maximize their productive efficiency, minimizing their costs of production to provide goods and services at competitive prices. This works to lower prices for consumers even further. More competition also puts pressure on firms to engage in more non-price competition, improving the quality of the products they offer. This provides a huge incentive for innovation and product development. There's also a profit argument here. Better access to markets abroad allows firms that are already providing goods at competitive prices to sell to a wider consumer base, raising their profit levels. This provides them with more funds to invest in innovation to become even more competitive. Finally, free trade can lead to greater allocative efficiency. Allocative efficiency occurs when goods that are being produced best match consumer preferences. Consider an oil-rich country such as Saudi Arabia. It produces many times the oil it requires to satisfy its own energy demands. Exporting the excess oil it produces overseas allows resources to be allocated in a more efficient manner. Rather than Saudi Arabia being left with more oil than it needs, the oil is being put to good use worldwide. This is another benefit of free trade. However, free trade does have its disadvantages. The first we have here is the infant industry argument. This primarily applies to developing countries with small but growing industries. Firms in such industries would find it difficult to compete on price with bigger, well-established rivals from more developed countries which can better exploit economies of scale. The argument here is that if free trade is restricted temporarily through tariff or non-tariff barriers, that provides time for these burgeoning sectors to grow and develop economies of scale to the point where they can compete with their international competitors. This means that in some cases it makes sense to restrict free trade, at least in the short term. Secondly, free trade and globalization have led to the offshoring of various industries such as manufacturing from developed countries, leading to higher levels of structural unemployment. This means that restricting free trade by erecting trade barriers could help to prevent higher unemployment. Lastly, restricting free trade can also help to reduce the impact of dumping on a country's economy. Dumping is when a country's businesses release exports on the international markets at artificially low prices to unfairly gain market share. This can decimate domestic industries in other countries that can't compete on price. One example of this is China taking part in steel dumping. It has been accused of dumping cheap steel on the global markets to force competitors in other countries out of business, and that's one reason why the Trump administration placed tariffs on steel and aluminium imports from China, restricting free trade. Economic integration refers to how deep economic ties are between countries. There are several stages along the path of increasing economic integration. going from loose associations of countries in a preferential trade area to complete economic integration, where the economies of member states are completely interlinked. You don't need to know everything on this slide, but understanding the different levels of economic integration will give you context for the content to come on free trade areas. To start off, preferential trade areas are trade agreements between countries agreeing to reduce tariffs on a specific range of goods and services. India and Chile currently have a FTA. A free trade area is a more broad agreement to reduce tariffs on goods and services, with few exceptions being made to tariff-free trade. Member countries can set independent tariff policies with other countries, but sometimes have a common external tariff, as I'll explain next. The US, Mexico, and Canada are in a free trade agreement called the USMCA. Customs unions go beyond this. They are free trade areas, but with something called a common external tariff, or CET. This means that each country in a customs union has the same tariff policy towards all non-member countries. The Latin American customs union Mercosur is an example of this. A common market bears all the features of a customs union, but there's more regulatory alignment and freer movement of capital and labour across national borders. The East African Community is an example of a common market. Next, an economic union has all the features of a common market, but member countries now share a common currency. The 19 member states of the Eurozone are in an economic union, with the euro being their common currency. Finally, complete integration occurs when individual states are both economically and politically interlinked, and are managed by a central government. The United States is a great example of this, as a union of smaller states that were previously independent. Let's focus more now on free trade areas. A free trade area is a group of countries where there are few to no trade barriers on products entering one country from another. The map here shows the world's FTAs in different colours. This is a little out of date as old FTAs have been scrapped and new ones have been added. In North America, NAFTA has been replaced by the USMCA, and RCEP is a new free trade agreement between 15 Asia-Pacific nations. There are 4 main points to consider when trying to gauge the significance of free trade agreements: trade creation, trade diversion, economic growth, and peace. Firstly, trade creation. Lowering tariffs between member countries of a free trade agreement encourages intra-regional trade. For example, when the UK joined the EU's free trade area in 1973, imports of French lamb to the UK boomed as it suddenly became cheaper to trade with France. Increased regional trade as a result of free trade agreements can give a huge boost to economic growth, as domestic producers gain access to an expanded consumer base and therefore benefit from higher demand for their goods and services. This helps to fulfill the important macroeconomic objective of stable and sustainable economic growth. Free trade also encourages people and nations to live in peace with one another. Free trade raises the cost of war by making nations more economically interdependent. In fact, the beginnings of the European Union were always driven by a goal to ensure lasting peace in Europe after the Second World War. Deepening economic ties between countries in Europe through free trade was seen as the best way to do this. However, one potential disadvantage of free trade agreements with common external tariffs is trade diversion. Having to raise tariffs on imports from non-member countries in line with the common external tariff can lead to a fall in trade with firms outside a free trade area. For example, although exporters of French lamb benefited from the UK entering the EU's customs union, imports of New Zealand lamb into the UK fell as a result of the common external tariff. This is an example of how joining a free trade area can divert trade away from countries, changing bilateral trade patterns. We've reached the end of the video now. As always, here's a news article and some accompanying questions related to free trade areas. Thank you very much for watching.